David Marr is a Fairfax journalist and a renowned author and commentator on Australian social issues. He's here with me at the CPX studio to talk about the results of a couple of recent surveys on Australians and their attitudes to religion. One was commissioned by Nielsen with David's involvement, and one by McCrindle Research for CPX. David, we want to talk to you about how religious Australians are these days. There was a time when we were known as the most godless nation under heaven, but what happened?
We never were the most godless nation under heaven. It was kind of a proud boast, like, we are a great larrikin nation. We're not. But religious, depends how you define it, of course, because on any given Sunday, 92% of us are not in church. So what this survey reveals is a deep well of faith, some of it cultural, but not attached to worship and not necessarily attached to any active part in any denomination of the church.
So you're referring to a Nielsen survey recently that discovered all sorts of things about Australian beliefs, and we were very interested here at CPX because it related quite closely to a survey we'd done ourselves, that belief in God in particular is very resilient.
Belief in God, or in a God of some kind, is high in Australia, the high 60%. Now, when you break that down a little, what you're left with is a belief in Christianity of a pretty neat 50% of the population. And then there are beliefs in some other gods, and then there is the belief in a kind of a universal spirit. But it's fair to say that half this country actively believes themselves to be Christian.
You also found that I think it was 24% of people are strongly atheistic now, and that's a rising figure.
24% strongly atheistic, and another 6% sort of doubters in the existence of God. So where we are in Australia is that roughly a third of us believe there isn't, or perhaps we can never know if there is, a God.
Do you think it's fair to say that the question of God has become a much hotter one in Australian society now?
I'm not sure about that. I think the question of God is a persistently hot topic in human cultures, and the shifts in Australian belief, while there's a slow and perhaps steady rise in disbelief in God, nevertheless there is an intractably large proportion of the population confident in the existence of a deity.
Now, some of the other figures were really fascinating to us. Like miracles, for example. You asked people whether they believe in miracles, and I think it was roughly
63%.
63% of people.
I think this shines a light on the national character. If we believe in miracles, and by the way, that belief in miracles is rising strongly over the last couple of decades, the belief in miracles, why plan? Why worry? Something will come along. We will be rescued. Do we really have to do anything about global warming? Surely a miracle will come along and solve the problem for us.
This belief leads to a sort of apathy about the world.
I think it leads to an attitude of let's wait and see. Let's hope that something will turn up.
We've got the likely sainthood of Mary MacKillop around the corner. Does this mean people are looking towards the gods for answers to things rather than towards themselves?
I think people always have, and this high belief in miracles would suggest that there is going to be a high belief that Mary MacKillop, or intercession to Mary MacKillop, did in some undefined and unproved way lead to a couple of cancer remissions. Whether this is a matter of any importance beyond kind of tabloid religiosity, I don't know. I myself doubt it. I think the whole thing reeks.
How well do the figures on those who believe in miracles match up with the figures of those who believe there is a God? Is there a perfect match there?
There is, in fact, a slight and disarming belief amongst atheists in miracles. But then the non-believers can't really be solidly defined as evangelical rationalists. They aren't by any means. Those who don't believe in the existence of God have very, very high beliefs in things like extrasensory perception and the stars.
Well, UFOs, 34% I think you had.
UFOs, yes. It's very interesting that most of these extraneous beliefs are even more strongly supported by Christians than by non-Christians. So obviously things like belief in miracles, but also belief in witches is slightly higher amongst Christians than non-Christians. But belief in UFOs is much higher amongst non-believers than by Christians. There seems to be a fundamental Christian scepticism about the UFO.
Isn't that interesting?
And reassuring.
Let's stick with Christianity a bit then. In our survey that we did, we asked a question about whether people thought Australian society would be better off or worse off without Christianity or with Christianity. We found that only 3% of Australians think we'd be better off without Christianity. In fact, 63% of Australians think we'd be worse off if you booted the Christian religion out, as Christopher Hitchens and others would like us to do. What do you make of that?
This gets to a fundamentally important thing about the role of religion in politics, which most people don't quite understand, and that is that even people without faith rather admire people with faith. They see that as a mark of values, of respectability, of virtue. Even if they don't believe there's a God themselves, if they are looking to the authority of somebody else to run a school or to be a politician and so on, they rather like somebody who is a Christian to do it. And that's why the political appeal to Christianity is to a larger pool than the pool of believers.
Why don't they trust a person of no faith but good moral stature?
Well, of course, a lot of people do, but this is a shorthand. This is a shorthand measure of trust in a large number of Australians who don't necessarily themselves believe in God or Christ or the Virgin Mary or any of the standard articles of the Christian faith.
But they think they'd like a person of faith to look after them or to pastor them, so to speak.
It's not the faith, I think, but the ethics that they're looking to here, that they see a correlation between Christian faith and the fundamental ethics of honesty and decency and charity. Now, I don't think that correlation is necessarily as high as a lot of people imagine, but I think that that's a common view, and a very, very important view in understanding the power of religion in politics in this country.
I'm talking with David Marr about the results of some surveys that have been done in Australia about Australian religious views. David, in your the Nielsen poll that you're involved with, you asked some questions about the Bible. You asked people whether they believed the Bible was literally the Word of God and so forth. I noticed in the results of the survey that there was a mention that not everyone was happy with that question. What do you think were the problems there? Do you think people felt there weren't enough options? Or?
Yes, and in other countries the questions have been asked slightly differently. I actually like the way we asked it, but some people would like a clearer definition of a text that is inspired by God but written by man, but nevertheless carries the absolute imprimatur of God. And well, there are many ways, as we know, that people regard the authority of holy texts, and there are many permutations. But there was a bit of a call for more permutations here.
It's obviously an important issue to a place like CPX. It's trying to explore genuine Christianity and its place in society, because there's so much room for misinterpretation of the scriptures and for people being ignorant about the scriptures, either as believers or unbelievers.
Then I think you should be particularly interested in the result that says, and it's a low result, that something like only about a quarter of believers believe that there is only one way to interpret their belief. Most Australian Christians are happy with the idea that their own faith and the Bible's role in their own faith is capable of multiple interpretations. A very important finding, I think.
Very interesting, and I guess shows the need for education in the scriptures and understanding of how to read properly in order to tease out interpretations and to weigh them against each other and to analyse them.
I think it also calls for a good deal of tolerance and respect for people whose interpretations of scripture are markedly different from your own.
We found in our survey a big difference in the question of religious tolerance in Australia against other places around the world. For example, we asked people, were they happy at Christmas time to have Christian carols sung in shopping centres? 91% of Australians were completely happy with that. Yet in other places in the world you could end up in the courts as a result of that. Why do you think Australians have a different attitude to other places on this question of the tolerance of religion in public?
This is a huge and fascinating question. Part of it is about the time Australia was founded, or the white European Australia was founded in the very late 18th century, early 19th century, and Australia had never went through any of the kind of violently passionate confrontations with church that were part of the history of most continental countries. That huge confrontation had happened in Britain, of course, in the 16th century, a long time ago. But we don't come from a tradition of fearing the privileges and the powers of the church. We just don't come from that tradition. So when our poll asked, do you think church and state should be separate? An absolutely resounding 85% of Australians said church and state should be separate. But by
Whereas in the
almost,
States you'd find a totally different
by
result to
almost
that.
any measure, Australia, church and state are deeply entwined. So Australians are content with the level of secular, political and religious interaction in this country. Australians are perfectly happy. Well, I'm not perfectly happy is an exaggeration, but Australians are more or less content with the billions of dollars of tax revenue which are paid to church schools in this country. Now that's an impossibility in the United States, but here we're quite content with it.
In your Nielsen poll, you found that only, I think it was 6% of Australians have a commitment to a faith other than Christianity.
There is a pool actually of 12% that say, look, I have a faith of some kind, and some of those faiths are easily identifiable in the traditional faiths of Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and a couple of other world religions. But there is also what we might call a hazy area of people who sort of believe in a divine spirit of some kind, or people who have a strong sense of God in their world, but absolutely no way of categorising that in traditional religious terms.
And that's the 6%, is it?
Well, no, that in all makes up about 12% of the population. But the 6% of traditional non-Christian religions is a measure of the extent to which Australia remains homogeneously Christian, even in both religion and cultural traditions. Now, I'm not praising it for this. This is just looking at the figures. And looking at the figures of Australia, you have to say that this country is a Judeo-Islamic Christian country, and Islamic in the sense of the Pentateuch. I mean, the faith in the first 5 books of the Bible is shared by nearly 60% of the population. We are
Australian children of Abraham.
We are children of Abraham in this country. Beautiful way of putting it.
I'm talking with David Marr about Australians and their religious views. David, I love a quote of yours, a recent quote where, and sorry to give your words back to you, but you said, like the Greens, atheism is always about to break through, but never does.
Yes, you know, every election we're told this is the one where the Greens will break through. No, atheism has slowly risen in this country. At the time of Federation, we were roughly 100% believers, according to the very first census that were taken of the new Federation. Now the figures are down, as we've said, in the high 60s. And the interesting thing about the non-believers is how certain they are of their non-belief. They're overwhelmingly, there is no God, rather than the perhaps middle position of, I don't know, and we can never tell that there's a God. We are confident in our beliefs in gods, and we are confident in our beliefs that there are not gods.
That's very interesting. There's a big convention in Melbourne coming up, an atheist convention with Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer and others speaking there. What do you imagine might be the impact of such a convention? I mean, will it have a sort of Billy Graham crusade effect and bring people to atheism?
Atheism, it's a bit hard to be swept away by atheism. I mean, I've reached a position of being a completely convinced atheist by a series of, trial, error, disappointments and thought. But it's not a conversion experience. And the Billy Graham kind of conversion experience, and I'm old enough to have been to some Billy Graham crusades, is a highly emotional manipulative experience, I find very distasteful in retrospect. I don't think you're going to get that out of the secular convention. I think they will be talking to people who are already essentially non-believers, and good luck. I think that's a very important part of the intellectual dialogue of this country.
I recently had the chance to interview a leading sociologist in the US, Philip Jenkins, who has a thesis that religions don't die off, they have to be killed. And there really isn't anything strong enough to kill off Christianity as a religion, as the atheists would like to see happen.
Has he got any evidence of Christianity ever being successfully killed? I mean, the Russians put in an enormous effort over a long time. It seems to spring back. In fact, I've got a theory that the gods of Greece and Rome are still with us at least in our imaginations. People talk all the time about God, the God of love, the God of war. It's still part of our imaginative vocabulary. I think what this all points to is a deep human involvement in notions of God. That's part of the human race, from my view, to invent gods and to have gods. That seems fundamental to a large part of the human imagination and human cultural and intellectual traditions. Now, to my mind, that doesn't prove that any gods exist, but you cannot understand the human race without understanding its passion to have gods.
Do you think in Australia we have an open enough public square to have that debate about God and about belief and about its importance?
You know, I think one of the things that these figures suggest, and this is a hypothesis of mine, you can't prove it from the figures, is that a lot of these questions simply are not part of the intellectual or day-to-day cut and thrust of life in Australia. I mean, if we were seriously engaged in the question of church and state, it would be impossible, I think, to come out to produce such confident figures that all is well in the relations of church and state. And I think some of the figures of, zany beliefs like UFOs and extrasensory perception and witches and things are an indication that we don't think in this country, in the public square or indeed much in our private lives, we don't argue much about the principles of belief and about the principles of reality and the principles of rational understanding of. We just, as in so many other things in this country, which is part of what makes it a deeply attractive and deeply infuriating place, these questions of principle just slide by.
David Marr, thanks very much.
Pleasure.